All right, I think we're in. Everything should be set. And so let us jump in without further ado. So my name is Jed Applerouth, founder of Applerouth Tutoring Services. Been doing this since 2001, so a few years. Definitely seen quite a few changes in the testing landscape over the many years. And so I feel very comfortable with this content. The world as we know it is now a test optional world. Didn't used to be the case. When I started this business, there were a very small number of schools that were test optional and test required was the rule, was the norm. Before the pandemic, this was the rule. And then suddenly no one could get testing and the entire world became optional. Today, around 2,000 of the 2,500 four-year schools are test optional. So is there a way to get into a school without a test score? Absolutely. There are many, many schools. They're not very selective. Many schools where there's a clear path. But we're seeing some changes in the last year, the last 2 years, where test scores are having a comeback. And so that's the reason you're here. And also, even for schools that are test optional, test scores can make a real difference. So they can strengthen and they can encourage, they can help your chances of getting in and getting merit-based aid and getting into a competitive program. So test scores, we're still in a world where those matter, and they're mattering more this year than last year and more than the year before. All right, let's jump in. Part of it, I need to update this for last year's data, which should be out now. But the SAT is the dominant test in the country. It wasn't always the case. If you look back about 10 years ago, the ACT was on top, but they faltered. They had some issues. The pandemic didn't treat them very well, and then they haven't really recovered. And so they've been making some pretty big changes. They were purchased by Nexus Capital, a private equity company. They're changing leadership, their direction, and they just unleashed a brand new test, a redesigned test. I think there's a question. Actually, no, I think we're okay. The Q&A, I think there's a Q&A, and there is, give me 1 second, there's a chat and a Q&A. Let me keep my Q&A open. I think we're actually okay with that. All right, delete. But the long and the short of it is, SAT is dominant. About 2/3 of our kids take the SAT, about 1/3 take the ACT, and didn't used to be the case, but every school in the country will accept either the SAT or the ACT without prejudice, without preference. They're agnostic, completely agnostic. So the name of the game is, which one's better for my kid? Is my kid going to do stronger on the SAT or the ACT? Colleges, they're indifferent. So make sure you know that. And sending both in doesn't help you any. If I send them a strong score on the SAT, I have checked the box for testing. I don't need both. It isn't like APs where more could be better. In this case, once you've checked the box for admissions testing, you're good. So be mindful of that. But the ACT, I expect with their new shorter test, they're going to start seeing an uptick. But right now, the SAT, the College Board is doing great. All right, let's keep going. So some of you have heard the news over the past couple of years that testing is back at a lot of the named schools. A lot of the top 25 schools in the country, about 15 of them or more now require testing. So 7 of the 8 Ivies, plus MIT and the Caltech and the UT Austin, many great schools, and there are more coming. We expect about 7, 8 schools go test required every year, and these are some of the most competitive schools, the most desired schools in the nation. So it's getting harder and harder for a really sharp kid to have a complete list without having a test score. In the lower tiers, it's no problem. But for those going for these selective schools, testing is, you really limit yourself without a test score these days, especially even the big flagship state schools. So the flagships are coming back strong, especially the southern flagships. If you're in the South and you're looking at staying in the South, or the SEC or big football, ACC schools, they're more and more of them keep going back to test required. The University of Florida system, their 20 schools never left during the pandemic. With their governor, they're like, nope, testing was locked in because of their Bright Future Scholars program, where testing and GPA is so tied to their admission and scholarships. They said, we're keeping it. And then Georgia has the Hope Scholarship. And now for a minute, it was just Georgia and Tech. Then they added in Kennesaw, Georgia State, Georgia Southern. So now all their 8 schools, the top 8 schools in Georgia system are required. In the last few months, Alabama is now required. Auburn is required. UT Austin went about a year ago. The entire UT system in Tennessee, they're required. Waiting on UNC, waiting on USC, waiting on Mississippi, maybe Louisiana, so LSU, other schools. But we're seeing the map fill in, and potentially even Virginia and other, really strong schools like that, like Texas and so forth. So if you're looking at the very selective privates or the big state flagship schools, testing is going to become more, more and more of a requirement at more and more of these schools. So the world of optional admissions for these top schools, it's getting less likely. Here's a quick calendar, just getting a sense of how this all rolled out. I live in Georgia, where again our governor was somewhat opposed to all of the changes and the shutdowns. So Georgia went back test required pretty early on, within about a year and a half of the pandemic. Then Georgetown came right back, MIT, and then you see the calendar. But look at the last year. Just last year, we had quite a few schools, and I'm gonna have to get a new slide here or add another line for this year because there's more coming, and probably we'll see some coming in, with February, March. But last year, Miami jumped on board in January, then Penn, Ohio State, Carnegie Mellon, Auburn, Princeton, Alabama, and the year before that, you had all these Ivies jumping in. So it's just you have to expect that we're going to be seeing this trend. It's not, a fading trend. It's actually pretty steady, pretty constant. We're seeing from 2022 to 2024 last year. So more schools are joining this trend. All right. If you're curious about what schools might go next, one thing to look at is the percent of students in a class for college that submitted test scores and were accepted and enrolled. So like Princeton, that was about 7 in 10 kids. Penn, 7 to 10 kids, and boom, lo and behold, now they are test required. So looking at other schools like that, UNC, UVA, Chicago, Emory, there's a decent chance that some of those schools with that high percentile of submitters are going to go required. Because there are other schools in the country where the enrolled class, the test submitters is like 30%. I think New Hampshire, it's in the low 20s. So for a school like New Hampshire, about 8 in 10 kids don't send test scores and are enrolled. About 2 in 10 do. So for that school, testing really isn't that big of a deal. Not so important, not as big a factor. But schools like this, testing is more of a factor. And especially for schools like UNC, UVA, admitting a lot of very strong kids out of state, that's where testing matters even more. In Chicago, obviously, they're a very strong school. The rationale for all this, Stuart Schmill at MIT said, our research shows we can't predict who will do well at MIT without having a test score. That, the kids without test scores are the ones who were failing out, couldn't handle the harder math. And then we're learning from all these top schools like Brown, Yale, at Dartmouth, other places, test scores are a better predictor of success at these colleges than grades because there's been a lot of grade inflation and a lot of kids are coming with their 4.0s or their 3.8s unweighted. They get into Brown or they get into Yale or the Dartmouth and they really struggle. But a test score, you get a 1450, it shows you have a certain level of ability, certain level of accomplishment in math and verbal, which is a standardized measure, different than a 3.8, because a 3.8 can mean very different things at different schools around the country. And there's been a lot more A's given, and A's aren't nearly as special as they used to be. This was the graph that led to at least 10 schools, the 7 Ivies plus MIT plus Stanford. It's this graph right here. That here you can see the nice correlation, the nice, as test scores go up, grades increase at these Ivy plus schools. Versus on the right side is GPA. As GPA in high school creeps up, it doesn't really affect performance. So we're learning that those kids with a 3.8 are doing about the same as those with a 3.1 in terms of college performance, but those with a 1,500 are doing a lot better, a 3.6 versus a 1,200 to 3.2. So if you want a better predictor at these schools that are very selective, test scores are your friends. And this is the reason we're going to see more and more schools go test required. It's this graphic here. So that's why. Anyone who tells you test scores don't predict much, not for these schools that are very selective. Maybe schools are not selective, but for these Ivy plus 4 schools, analyzing the apps of 1.5 million kids, this is the trend. So pretty clear. At UT, which tells me we're going to see more flagships. UT admits tens of thousands of students, and they have huge crush of applications. I think out of state UT has like 8% admission rate. They're incredibly competitive. But they found that kids who didn't send test scores were much more likely to be on probation academically and fail out. And also at mid-year, freshman year, those who sent test scores had 0.86 higher grade points. So that's like a 3.5 versus a 2.64, which is a very, very meaningful difference. Those kids without test scores did not do as well at Texas, and they said, okay, test required. I'm expecting Texas Tech, maybe Texas A&M, other schools, LSU, because they're similar. They're competitive. They're good schools. They're big state schools. And why is Texas unique? I mean, essentially, this pattern probably exists at many other very competitive states, flagship schools. Same with Ohio State. And also, John Ladding down the street over at Emory, where I live, he was very clear. Grades are inflated. We do not trust grades the same way as it used to be. Therefore, we're going to be weighing external assessments. That means SATs, ACs, and APs. So that's the same thing if you're looking at the UC system, looking at UC Irvine, UC Davis, UC LA, UC Berkeley. They are currently test blind for the SAT, ACT, but you can rest assured they look extremely closely at your AP scores and your IB scores. Because again, all these kids are coming in with 3.9s. And so how do we differentiate? We want to see performance on something. And if we can't look at the SAT, ACT, we're going to weight the APs very heavily. So be mindful of that when you're applying to one of the few test blind schools in the country. And there are about 50 or so test blind schools, test free schools. The majority of them are in California, but there was a report, you may have come across it recently, out of UC Davis, that the number of kids getting into UC Davis who are completely remedial in math, can't do eighth grade algebra, that number is skyrocketing since they've been test blind. Because the testing was a ballast against kids who got an 800 on math. That was a clear indicator. But then when that gets hidden and you have a 3.7 with your 800, you get to Davis and you can't do math. Oh my gosh! Now I need to throw out resources, tutoring. We have remediation. We have probation. It's a whole mess for these schools. So I think there's a world where even you see that entire system where they've been test blind now since 2021. I would not be surprised if they go back test optional. Same thing happened for Caltech. Caltech was test blind. Now Caltech is test required. Complete turnaround. Worcester Polytechnic, they said testing doesn't matter. It's not predictive. We don't need it. They were test blind. They fired that admissions director and now they are test optional. So in Worcester Poly, they were very strongly they were bullish about being test blind, but it's like test scores kind of help. So yeah, UC, was it San Diego? UCSD, not UC Davis. Thank you. I have to look at that. But I believe you're right now. I just need to go and look at my notes. It's been a few weeks or a few months since the report came out. All right. And so here we go. We know that even for schools, so we have this increase in test required admissions. That's going to keep going. There'll be more schools coming in this next few months. And then over the course of the year, probably 6, 7 schools will come like last year. But even in the schools that are optional, testing still matters. And that's why this is critical for looking at schools that are very selective or big state schools. If they're optional, many of them, but they're not, testing is not irrelevant. And so it can still factor in, it can still impact your admission rate and so forth. It can affect merit-based aid. I always throw out Alabama, where their tuition is greatly affected. They're attracting like half their class. More than half of their class does not come from Alabama, but you didn't know that. It's like 40-some% comes from Alabama, from in-state. But the rest, they're pulling from all over the country with these amazingly generous scholarships they offer. My niece got a 1390 on the SAT, and she was awarded that UA scholarship. She's from Richmond, Virginia, Midlothian. Her tuition would have been $33,000 a year, but instead, they said your tuition is going to be around $8,000 a year. $9,000 a year because of your test score and your 3.5 GPA. And 3.5 GPA, that's not that tough. A lot of kids have that. And then you can see that they're paying serious merit money. And the gamble they're making is we're going to, let you in cheaper on tuition, but we think we're going to get it back on the back end. We're going to have more successful alumni, have better earning power, going to be more generous in the back end. So we'll give you a discount now. We'll get it in spades later. That is the logic of that, the merit-based aid. So test optional. Should my kids still prioritize testing? Still matter a part of it? Again, many things are optional in your application, but still have an impact. Academic rigor, leadership, other things, setting your AP scores. These are all optional things, but they have an impact. So don't think that optional means blind. Here's some data that came out for about a couple years. Post-pandemic, there was this big crush of, wow, this is all so new, and let's be very transparent and report our data. And we found schools like Emory and UVA saying, okay, we'll actually report our admit rate with tests and then without. But now they have locked all that down. They're not sharing because they want everyone to send in their application. And they don't want to show this kind of data that, hey, at certain schools, the admit rate with test scores is 2-to-1. At Colgate, Notre Dame, Boston College. And Yale was interesting. Yale was test optional. And Yale, they, after a few years of this policy, they came out, and Jeremiah Quinlan, the director of admissions, said, you know what, we felt like we were not being totally forthright because the admit rate for kids with test scores was about 6%, without was around 2%. So with no test score, about 2 in 100 kids get in. So now they're back test required, but they're doing a test flexible because of California, really, that either they'll take the SAT, the ACT, or all of your APs, all of your IBs. But they need a suite of tests. There's no more test optional. Now you are required, but you have some flexibility there. But again, there are many schools who we don't have this data, and you can only assume. My assumption is when you're seeing a school where the percent of enrolled students, where there are the majority of kids enrolled sent test scores, I think it's pretty likely that there's going to be a preference for kids with test scores in terms of the admissions pool. But again, they're not sharing that, but just an assumption from and looking at some of the past data we have. Some schools are giving a clue, like Grinnell uses words like if you have score, if you have scores, they may help you. If you don't submit a score, we have less information about you. BC said, we encourage students. If you see the word may help you, we encourage, we suggest, we recommend, ding, 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 ding. They're giving you a very strong signal that scores are a factor, and a factor that's meaningful for admission. Tufts is very transparent. If you have a 1300, which is actually below their middle 50, we want to see that score. We encourage you. So again, the words encourage versus my niece got a 1390, spoke to a rep from Tulane. The Tulane rep said, if you get under a 1420, don't send it. And she didn't send it, and she got into Tulane with a little bit of merit aid. So it's like, listen to the admissions officers when they tell you what they want, or if they post it, but this is pretty unusual. There are schools, like the University of Chicago has a do no harm policy. They say, send your scores, which is why their submission rate is in the mid 70s. If the score is high enough, we'll use it, and it'll help you. If not, we're not going to use it in admissions. So I love when there are do no harm policies, but they're relatively rare. Auburn, interestingly, just pivoted in the last quarter. Now they were optional until just recently. Now they strongly encourage, but this is pretty amazing that, when it comes to the testing, they only 5% of the applicant pool will be considered without a test score. So it's test optional, but 5%. So they are just pretty much closing the door, and then starting next fall, you're going to all have to be required to submit a test score. So that's their pivot there. So Auburn, they were conditional for a little bit, where you had to have a 3.6 GPA or above to be optional, but now they're like, we're locking it down. So I see there'll be more of this coming too. So what's happening? More students are sending scores, and now we're seeing the trend from the data from November, December for the Common App. More kids are submitting with test scores than without. There's growth on all categories, all groups of students sending test scores. And here we have the reporters versus withholders. And this is going to continue. And eventually we're going to have reporters, I'd estimate, over 60%. And, even in the last year, you had with these 7 schools, you added 400,000 kids who must send a test score. And the year before, 400,000 kids. So as these schools keep, requiring test scores, you're going to have more and more kids reporting a test score. That's just math. So the nature of it. Now, testing matters more for certain groups. Testing matters more for engineers. Engineers, they want that math score. Business majors, because finance, that's calculus, that's derivatives. You're pricing derivatives, you have to take calc too. STEM kids in general, math majors, computer science kids, though there are fewer computer science kids now, everyone's rushing towards the new AI majors. But you need math, you need quant skills. And so, because again, they have kids with a 93 average in calculus, but then then they get a 550 in math. Boom, that pretty much devastates that 93 in calculus. Or you get a 1 or 2 on the AP. It's like, oh, you got a 93, but you don't know calculus. And if you can't do the math on the SAT, once you get the differential equations and in linear, really advanced math, it's going to be tough if you can't do algebra 1, algebra 2, which is what we're looking at on the SAT and ACT. So wrote an article in August about engineering. It seems like it's really pushing hard on test required. And even if you're looking at a school now that's test optional for engineering, it might not be by the end of this year. And now you're pulling up some of the schools, the top 16 programs. Now we got Penn, you got Hopkins, Cornell, Austin, Caltech. All these schools that are highlighted are test required. Cooper Union announced they're required for their engineers. All the 4 academies, the Naval Academy, it's about a third engineering. They're all test required, all the academies. Worcester Poly, I mentioned, was test blind for 3 years, and now they're optional. Because again, that math score means a lot for STEM kids. So additionally, testing matters more if you're applying to a school that's highly selective. When a school is admitting less than 15% of kids, they get a lot of good applications, a lot of kids with strong grades and strong rigor. Testing is one way to differentiate. Same with strong APs. I mean, when they're taking 1 in 7 kids, everything needs to be strong. Essentially, you have to be very competitive when they're turning down 7 out of 8 kids, which is a lot of these schools now. Because with the pandemic and after that, and with test optional, everyone's applying to the name schools with all the anxiety around AI. Everyone's trying to go for prestige, go for some solid ground. Maybe the name will hold me and carry me. So everyone's applying to these schools. So these schools that are selective are getting more selective. That's been the trend in the last several years. Like the winners keep winning, the rich get richer. That's the idea. Whereas a lot of schools out there, many schools are not selective. And the average school out there of the 2,500 4-year schools is not very selective. Like they're accepting 7 in 10 kids, 8 in 10 kids, but it's just everyone's looking at the same 200 schools or the same 50 schools even. And those schools are, because of that, are becoming very selective. So when you have selective flagship state schools, they're going to become probably more weight on test scores like a UNC or the really strong privates. All right, so that is the world we live in. I want to talk more about the actual tests themselves and answer questions. Some of you may have deeper dive questions. I can go as nerdy as you want, but the high level is often what people want to spend time and talk about. So structurally, we have this slide looked very different about 2 years ago. And geez, the SAT, I've been doing this for 24 years, used to be a 5-hour test. And there were 10 sections, there was an optional essay, it was aligned with the Common Core. So many changes have taken place. Right now, it is short and sweet, and it's digital. And I was amazed the SAT, the College Board, went digital first. The ACT, with their previous leadership under Martin Rorta, they promised every test we make will be digital and adaptive. But then they fired Martin during the pandemic, and now the person who succeeded him has really backed off that promise. They're going gradually, slowly. But the College Board said, forget it. There's too much fraud, too much cheating with paper-based testing. If one test leaks out, the whole thing is compromised. We want digital assessments. And then we can modify it. Every single student has a little bit of a different test, different order of the questions, different order of the answers. We can change the numbers slightly on math questions, so it's much harder to cheat. And so we have much more test security, and that's a big deal. So you have 2 short verbal sections, reading and writing smashed together. They were separate, now they're this, and they really reduce the amount of writing and grammar mechanics. There's more reading. Then you 10-minute break, come in there for math, 2 math sections, and you're done. 2 hours and 24 minutes, amazing. So short, you start at 8 o'clock, you're done by 11, awesome. You have your whole Saturday. ACT, they said, we'll beat you at your game. They were 3 hours, but now they said, here's what we'll do. We're going to shorten everything and make science optional. So now we have about a third of our kids don't take science, and we aren't prepping at all for science, though we advocate everyone take science one time and can spend the $10 in case a school requires it. But more and more in schools are saying, we're not going to use it. It's not essential. It's not really science. And even like the STEM engineering schools are saying, we're not going to require it. We're not using it. Like Georgia Tech doesn't even look at it. But so for 2 hours and 5 minutes, you have reading, English, math, then a little break, and optional science. Now, they both changed a lot. We're still using an old concordance table for the SAT and the ACT. But next year, they're going to come back together, and they'll have a new concordance. They'll have kids take both, and they'll create a new table. But for now, colleges use the old one, and it's fine. And maybe they're off by like 10 points, 20 points, but it's not that meaningful of a difference. And it would never change someone's outcome for admissions. Even if a 26 corresponds now to a 1220, not a 1210, not a big deal. But look at that just right, because both tests, there's been a tiny bit of drift. They said on the ACT it was around less than a fraction of a point. On the SAT, the old and the new, they said they were about a 14-point swing. So not a big difference. The SAT, it is digital and adaptive. Everyone walks in there and takes the baseline verbal section, 27 questions. And if I get if I get 2/3 right, I'm going to the hard adaptive section. If I miss more than a third, I'm going easy, and I'm locked into that one for the module that's adaptive. So there's a baseline module, establish where are you with a smattering of easy, medium, hard questions. and then I'm kicked to either a harder one, which that skews more difficult, or I'm kicked out to an easier one. And that affects my total score possibility. Then 10-minute break, same thing with math. Like it's smattering of easy, medium, hard questions. More than 2/3 right, I'm going to the hard section, less going to easy. And they may create more variations, more granular distinctions. Like they could have an easy one, easy two, medium, hard, hard. It wouldn't really change this at all. Just showing you end up in a different place. That's the whole section adaptive idea of the SAT. The ACT is not adaptive at all. It's a linear test. And you take it in paper or a computer. And we at Applerouth advocate doing it on paper for a number of reasons. We like the format more with paper, and it's still a little bit wonky. Their digital, the software they're using at the ACT. It's TestNav is still not as sharp as the College Board's Blue Book, and so we say if you have an option for paper, go paper. If you're doing a school day test and it's going to be digital, that's okay too. But again, linear and non-adaptive, either paper or digital. It's just a linear test, no changes. All right, science, optional. A little bit less speedy. They give kids more time per question, but it's not part of your score anymore. It's not part of your score for the ACT. It's a separate score. So you're going to say, I got a 27 on the ACT and I got a 30 on science. It's not included. It's not average. It's a separate standalone score like the essay used to be. So be mindful of that. Timing. The ACT is still a speedier test. You can look at the time per question. SAT, you have 71 seconds per question on verbal versus 52 seconds on the ACT. And the same thing, you have about 30 more seconds per question on the SAT math. So we have more kids who finish the SAT without timing challenges. Some kids are rushing at the end, especially if they're going to the harder modules, but more of our students still grapple with the ACT, which is one of the reasons why getting an accommodation for extra time is more impactful, more meaningful on the ACT, because you can see here, it's a speedier test and they're privileging processing speed, less so on the SAT. All right, the ACT, being a linear test, a non-adaptive test, you have to have more items. You have 54 items total for the verbal section on the SAT, and then versus 86 items with reading and English on the ACT. So you have an extra 32 items. And so even for the total test, you have 98 total items on the SAT. Then you have 131 without science, and then you have 171 with science. So the SAT is a much more economical test, and they can get it done faster because, again, they're doing adaptive testing. And a kid going to the hard module is not going to see a bunch of easy questions, which they have to show on the ACT, which is linear. Every section has easy, medium, hard, no matter what. It doesn't change. The format is every section on the SAT has 2 experimental items that don't affect a kid's score. On the ACT, you have experimental passages on English and reading and science in big blocks. Like so there are 50 items in English, but one of those 5 passages doesn't count. For reading, the same thing. You have 36 questions, but one of those 4 blocks on reading doesn't count. Same thing with science. There are about 6 passages. One of them doesn't count. But math, 4 of the items just don't count. So that's just showing you that on the SAT, 8 of the 98 items, about 10%, are experimental. But on the ACT, you have a total of 29 items don't count. That's 17%. So just more items are experimental, which makes the actual number of functional items a little bit lower. So like for the reading score, you only have 27 functional items, which is different. So what that means is mistakes count more. Careless errors will hurt you more when you have fewer actual functional items. We believe paper is better. So if given the choice, if you're signing up your kid for the ACT, choose paper. Period, paragraph. We don't love TestNav. It's clunkier. They're getting better. They're finally letting you bring your own device, which was promised for about a year, and it finally arrived. It's rolling out, and it's going to be available everywhere soon. Still waiting on our international students where they can't do it yet. Hopefully this spring. And so they also are letting you do it on Chromebooks, Windows, and MacBooks, which is good. So that's a good thing. A few problems. I don't love their formatting. If I highlight on item number 2, and then I advance to the next question, my highlights disappear, which I think is totally not smart. You want durable highlights, which they have on the SAT, but on the SAT, you only have one question per passage. It's kind of like TikTok, where they go boom, a little poem, 5 lines of text, a question, next, brand new. Then you're onto a grammar question. Then boom, you're onto a little, a sonnet. So it's every single there. You don't ever go in the same passage more than one question. One passage, one question, next. That's the SAT. All right. Also, long form reading is a little bit more challenging. And there are some issues where it directs you, like on question 7, one main point of the highlighted paragraph is that blank, and it doesn't automatically guide you there. You have to kind of scan it and then find the highlights, which to me is just bad design. So they need some more design on this test, better designers, versus the Blue Book app. Beautiful, elegant, short and sweet, one question on the same little page, one paragraph, and you're done. Then next thing, brand new topic. Elegant, short, sweet. They really redesigned this test for digital, whereas the ACT is trying to force fit their paper test into a digital format, which is why I don't love it for kids. The ACT in December finally got a license agreement with Desmos to catch up with the SAT. They've had Desmos for over a year. And Desmos is a calculator that half of your kids use. They use it for chemistry, for physics class. It's a great graphing tool, and it's really critical. You can solve all these problems just with Desmos, even if you don't know the algebra or some of the mathing. I just graph it, and boom, I solved it. Very handy. So finishing the ACT, I mentioned that they made it a little bit easier on timing. Here is an example of the current form versus the enhanced form. The enhanced form, that's just no science. So blue is English, math, reading, and science. And then the orange shows you the test without the science requirement. And so you can see on the new test, English and math, kids really aren't finishing at a higher rate. But with reading and science, kids are finishing, but still, only 7 in 10 kids finish the science with time to, and feel comfortable. And the same thing, so a lot on math, a lot of kids still are struggling with timing on the ACT. And this graph will look very different for the SAT, but I haven't seen this graph. This is part of the research they released, the quantitative studies they released about 2 years ago. So ACT, still speedier compared to the SAT, know that. Science, ACT science is mostly reading comprehension and some math. So getting rid of the science section is not going to affect the majority of kids. It's not a real science test like chem or bio or physics, C. Those are real science tests. That measures how much science you know. This is how well do I read? Can I interpolate points in a chart or in a graph? Can I extrapolate beyond the end of the graph? And honestly, so few of our tests for admissions have a science section. GMAT, no. GRE, no. The SAT, no. So you don't really need the SSAT for getting into private school. You don't need to have a science test to measure are you ready for these schools. So I think over time, I think science is going to go away for a few years. And here is one of the compelling things. When I look at my highest composite score, look at the full 1.4 million kids versus those enrolled in four-year colleges, the delta between the scores with English, math, and reading and with science is like only 0.1 points. The average is 22.7 versus 22.8. It's not that big of a deal of a difference because there's so much collinearity that if you do really strong on science, on average, you're going to score in a similar fashion on the English and the math because it's really measuring your reading skills and your math skills. So rarely does science, because it's not a pure science test. If it was testing actually what biology you know, that would be a different number. But because it's really a math and reading test, it correlates so highly, which makes it really unnecessary. Which is why so many colleges are saying, we're not going to use it, we don't need it. BU is one of the weird schools that says, hey, we're test optional. But if you send an ACT score, we need a science section. That's unusual. But again, why I say to every kid, everyone take science one time, spend $10, it's worth it. Colleges not requiring science, this is a small handful, Harvard, Stanford, Brown, Cornell. But there are like 2,400 colleges that haven't made an opinion on this one public. And it's kind of weird that so few schools have on their website if they require it or not. And then, so hundreds of colleges have told us nothing. There are a few exceptions. Georgetown, Pomona, BU, they want to see a science score. It's recommended for Duke, Michigan State. The Florida Publics wanted it, and they dropped that requirement. It's optional. And but we believe that if you're taking the ACT, take it one time, spend $10, it's worth it. And then they're going to give you your score back. And you have your composite 34, math 32, science 30, English 36, reading 33, you would assume from this graphic that the science section is being included in that composite score, but it's not. If that 30 was in there, your composite would be a 33. So that science, again, this is just bad design. That should be a different color. It should be off on the right by itself. It does not count at all towards your composite. Okay, so just make sure you're aware of that one. All right. In terms of, and there aren't that many kids who had a legacy ACT. Now it's as of the fall, every test that's being given is the enhanced. Enhanced just means shorter, more time per question, and science optional. Like legacy is just the old one for the past 10 plus years. And so if you have at least one of the new scores, then your super score will exclude science. Okay. Vandy's interesting. They have a do no harm policy. And they're going to include science in the super score if it helps you. So again, some schools do their own thing like that. There is some information about super scoring. I'll have this slide up probably through May, and then I'll get rid of it because at that point, no one will have taken the legacy ACT. Some of your kids might have over the summer or before it changed officially in September. Those who don't super score the old and the new, a small number of schools, Harvard, UT, Michigan State, Colorado College, Rutgers, and those who do, and then you have 2,400 who have no opinion on it. They have no statement on their websites, no press release, so it's not really a big deal, honestly, the science. And I really believe over time the science will disappear. They overlap about 80-some%. These things are very similar. There's been a lot of convergence. When I started off in 2001, these things were similar about 60%. But then the SAT started shedding vocabulary. They got rid of their sentence completions. They got rid of, their analogies. There are still sentence completions. They got rid of their antonyms. There was all this advanced vocabulary which went away. And then they had all this weird math that only lived on the SAT. All that got ripped out. So now these things, it really is more Common Core. It's really what do you learn in high school? A lot of overlap. The SAT, the reading level is higher. You have an 11th grade level of reading for the SAT. They're going to throw in William Blake or William Shakespeare, Emily Bronte. You're going to see passages that are hard by design. So we have an 11th grade level of reading versus a 9th grade level on the ACT. So the reading level is lower on the ACT. Also, the science section, there is more, quote, science being assessed than you have one passage on the SAT for the reading. But the math is harder. There is more advanced math on the ACT. You're going to see math that goes deeper into like Algebra 2 and even a little bit pre-cal. The SAT is predominantly algebra and advanced math. You have twice as much geometry and trig on the ACT, and they both have data analysis, a little bit of trigonometry, like very, very light, a little bit of stats. They'll do a scatter plot or two, but the ACT, they're going to throw some hard concepts like matrix multiplication, conic sections, ellipses, hyperbolas, parabolas, asymptotes, lines of best fit. You will never see any of this on the SAT. So these things only appear in like rotation. They have a few really advanced ones per test, but you have to know a lot more. Our book for the ACT is a lot bigger because the math section is just, they cover a lot more math on the ACT. And the ST math, it goes from easy to hard. 22 questions, 2 of them are experimental. You have your calculator, you have scratch paper. If you need more, you raise your hand. You can bring your own calculator, and your own calculator, like the TI is pretty helpful for doing means, median modes, averages. But Desmos is just wickedly good for anything graphing. And Desmos, you're taking the SAT and now the ACT, you've got to learn Desmos. You got to practice it. Many kids have some familiarity from their schoolwork, but if not, go on Desmos. You can practice. Again, one little example. They give you 2 algebraic equations, 2 little functions, and the question is, solve for y. All right, I could actually isolate solve for y, or I plug these into my calculator, just plug them right in, boom. Where the value for y, x is 5 and y is 3. That's our answer. So boom, intersection. That's the answer for the 2 equations intersecting. Now the verbal, every SAT passage is short and sweet, 150 words, 1 question, brand new one. AC is longer form, 10 questions a piece. 15 for English, so it's longer format. There are some shorter ones mixed in, but that's the standard format. For the SAT, it goes in the same structure every time, from easy to hard, then it resets. So first you do craft the structure, that's going to be words in context, connections, and then it goes easy to hard, then it resets back at easy. Kind of evidence questions, inference questions, easy to hard, it resets. Then grammar. Grammar is pretty short these days. There used to be a whole grammar section. Now our grammar section has shrunk. It's going to be form, structure, parallelism, boundaries, comma usage, things like that. And then expressions of ideas. Again, easy to hard. You're going on rhetorical synthesis, where they're going to give you a bunch of bullets asking you to give a synopsis of what it actually means, or transitions. So this, it's always the same structure every single time on the SAT. There are, I mentioned, easy and hard modules. And based on how I do, if I get 2/3 right, I go to the hard one. If I get 2/3, less than 2/3 right, I go to the easy module. And they look different. Your baseline module is mostly middle level questions. I have a couple of easy ones, a few hard ones. I'm mostly living in level 2 and 3 questions right in the middle. If I get more than 2/3, I don't get more than 2/3 right, I'm going to the easy section, which skews easy. Now my level 1 questions go from 2 up to 7. I have 9 level 2s, and I have fewer level 4s. If, however, I go to the hard section, my level 1s, I don't have 7 of them, I have 1 of them. And that's how you can get the efficiency from the College Board. You can go from having 40 questions to needing only, like 30, because I'm getting rid of the ones that aren't performing, that aren't functional. Because a student who's really strong in math, I don't need the level 1 questions. I'm going to crush those. Those don't differentiate, but I need more of the hard questions. So that's how you gain efficiency for these tests. Okay, there was a question. Hold on a second, Q&A. What's your recommendation for taking the optional science for a STEM engineering kid? Should they just take it in case? Yes. Everyone take it one time. The majority of STEM schools, like MIT or Georgia Tech, they don't care. The science section, they're very transparent. For science, they want to see a really strong math score on the SAT, and they want to see strong scores on the AP. How'd you do on physics? How'd you do, how's your calc? And they don't, if those kids are going to be, probably AB calc as a junior, BC calc as a senior, they want to know, did I get a 5 on AB as a junior? So the science section is not really a science section. It's really mostly reading and graphs and charts and tables. Okay. Now let me go on to item response scoring. So this is a little bit inside baseball, but for 95 years, the SAT, every single item counted the same. The easiest and the hardest questions, they were 1 raw point converted to 1 scale point. There was no differentiation. But now, different items have different weightings. I think there are up to 5 different weights. So a question that's a really important question, and it's also one of the reasons they're able to be more economical. They can eliminate 5 questions and say, we'll ask 1 question that's really important, and we're going to weight it more. Which means, though, if you miss that question, they can count off more. But you'll never know. And they don't tell you the weights, even when your score report. The score report now looks like this, which for a testing company is really worthless. Because before it would be, you missed number 17, here's test return. Now there's no more test return. There was a Truth in Testing Act passed, in Congress. It was Ralph Nader years ago in the 80s, where paper-based tests, they had to release like 3 tests a year, which they did. But that didn't apply to digital tests in the 80s. That they didn't have any. So now they aren't required. So they give you back these heat maps. Info and ideas, you got 5 out of 7. Did I miss 2, 3, 4, 5? No idea. Craft and structure, need a little work, but which questions, what did I miss, early, late? No idea. So this is the black box because of item response theory, and they're using differential weighting of problems. So that makes a score return that's helpful. But companies like Applerouth are really good. We give back a score report. It's fully detailed. You missed number 7. Here's what you chose. Here's why you missed it. And that's much more useful. So this makes other companies' practice tests more valuable than the official ones for feedback. So we have 4 full practice tests. We're working on 5 and 6. We're going to have more coming. And also I learned that Gemini is offering some free practice tests. You also have the 7 practice tests on the College Board's Blue Book app. And then there's a couple for the ACT. So there is practice. Make sure you use it. How do you prep? You prep by doing practice tests. You prep by getting ready with Desmos. You prep by taking tests with proper timing. So you can drill items. You also need to drill concepts. We have a really great book. The College Board has materials. You can get other books, Gruber's, Princeton Review, McGraw-Hill, Kaplan. Good books out there. I think ours is really special, but I'm obviously have a thought on that one. I saw the thousands of hours work that went into our book. Very tightly written and hugs very closely to the actual tests. In terms of which test do you want to try first, get your baseline on both. Colleges don't care. And some kids out of the gate, about 2/3 of kids, they're pretty close, but about a third of kids, they have an edge on one test or the other without any preparation. It's based on the way their brain works. They could be a stronger reader, which you probably do a little better on the SAT, or but then they're really, really speedy, better on the ACT. They're not so speedy, worse on the ACT. They can handle harder math, better on the ACT. But again, with all these different moving parts and variables, I can't tell how a kid will do without giving them a practice test. The nice thing is these tests are so short, 2 hours and 5 minutes, 2 hours and 14 minutes. You can do 2 tests on a weekend. Before that would be one test was 5 hours. The other one was like 3.5. That's 8 hours of your week, but now it's only 4 hours of your weekend. So you could knock out 2 baseline tests and then get on a path pretty easily. So if you score within 60 points on the scale of the SAT, let's say I get a 26 on the ACT and I get a 1230 SAT, you are within the margin of error because those line up pretty closely on the concordance table. At that point, on a given day, those could flip. However, let's say I get a 26 ACT, but I get a 1290 SAT. I can take it 5 times in a row and those scores won't flip. I have an edge that's significant and that's going to be durable. That's not just random sampling error of the items. That's on a given day I'll do better. In that case, I don't care about preference. Go with the stronger test. But if you're in that 60 points, because there's 30 points of error on each test, and so that's the margin. But beyond that, you actually are better on one test. So I recommend strongly your testing plan. 3 tests. I recommend that you have 3 tests officially on your plan. Even if you end up needing 1 or 2, have 3 because of super scoring. And many of our kids are one and done, and they use plenty of practice tests. They do prep. They take it one time, finished. But again, if I score 10 points stronger on math on one day, and then 10 points higher on verbal the next day, boom, that's meaningful. Or it could be 20 or 30 points difference. Things that matter. This was part of my graduate research for my PhD, was things that help practice tests. They really work. Take them. Kids with more practice tests did better on the final exams. When you spread things out, kids do better. Kids who do this prep over 2-3 months do better than those who prep over a weekend or over a week or over 2 weeks. You need time to learn, relearn, forget, re-strengthen, reinforce the learning. Kids who start earlier do better than those who wait later junior year. So ideally you have a little bit more time to prep because you have time for 3 tests. Also, time on task, pretty basic. Kids who put in more time on an AP do better than those who put in less time. Same thing with the SAT. It's time on task does have an effect, especially if you're doing mastery learning and you're studying very closely the ones you're missing. You're going back and reviewing very closely. I missed 13. Why? I chose B. The answer was C. Why did I not choose this one? Okay, I fell for that trap. When you practice like that, you get better. Don't just take a bunch of tests without the reflection and without that, getting the knowledge and reinforcing and learning. The reflection is critical. That's the gold. Also, finish strong. You don't want to do a prep class in the summer and then wait 5 months and take it cold. You forget things. Those memory stores do degrade naturally. So make sure if you're taking a test officially in February, that you take a practice test within 1 month, a timed test. And then finally, have a goal. When you have a goal, it's motivating. As I'm approaching that goal, I open up with a 26 on the ACT. My goal is a 32. So after my first test, I get a 28. Yay, I see that my efforts are leading to a higher score. I prep some more, review my ones I got wrong. Boom, I got a 30. Yay, it's reinforcing. So having a goal and making stepwise progress, towards a distal goal is very helpful and very reinforcing and motivating. All right, testing plans. They're pretty basic these days. We now have a September SAT for the first time in history, which I like. Now, there used to be no summer testing. That was a big deal in 2014, but suddenly an August test emerged. Now we have September. And so we have, which is great for kids, even as a senior, because you want to finish all testing before October, because that's when your early apps are going to go out, press submit. And I want testing done by September, okay? That's for all kids, because everyone will submit their test score, for your early application. But after that's gone, you can still test in October, November, December for those regular apps, which go out in January. But for your early apps, which often kids are going for their best schools, taking their best shot, ED or EA, you want testing done before those go out, because take your best shot. which means use the summers, but also it's lovely that you have August and September. And many kids that we don't, at ACT, you have 7 ACTs, and now you have 8 SATs over the course of the calendar year. That is very nifty. Different structures, but with all those options, you can prep over the summer, go knock out a test, wait and refresh it and take it in the spring. Some kids might prep in the summer, do a little refresher, and then go, November, December, March. Some kids wait until the summer and they do all summer testing, totally fine. So you have all these options which weren't available 12 years ago. So I like having the full range of tests. Super scoring, just to visualize this, I showed you before, let's say in March, I got a 670 in math. In June, I got a 660 on verbal. Boom, my composite score is a 1330, even though I never scored more than a 1310 in any individual test. That's super scoring. And the majority of schools super score the SAT, and many, many, many super score the ACT. You can pull up their websites or go on the College Board Big Futures and then pull up submission applying. It'll show you if they super score or not. The ACT super scores automatically. And when they send your score, that composite score is filled in with your super score from different test dates. All right, and science is not part of the super score. It's standalone, and that's important. Should you send your test scores in? Part of it is get your baseline test, figure out, and there are some kids who shouldn't do test prep at all. There are some kids who are phenomenal academically. They have 11 advanced classes, APs, dual enrollments. They're crushing it. 3, 9, 2 unweighted. And they go in and their test score is like a 1050. And it's like, oh my Lord. Because the gap between the schools they can get into with that 3, 9 and the 11 APs, and then they're getting 4s and 5s on the APs. But for some reason, they're just having a tremendous problem with the SAT. I would just build a phenomenal list of schools that are test optional, and you're going to get into a lot of them with that profile, even if you're testing. However, on the converse, a kid has let's say a 1250 SAT and the same profile academically. You're in, I need to get up to a 1450. That's very doable. That happens all the time. And so then suddenly your test score can be an asset. But for some kids, that gap is so huge. To get 400 points, it does happen, but it's really rare. And it's going to be a heck of a lift. I would just say, write heck of an essay, get great rec letters, activities, make sure your summers are using them really well. And I would bury that 1050. I would make sure my APs are as strong as possible, and I would apply to schools that are optional. Because again, there are hundreds and hundreds of schools. Every school out there has a lane for kids that's optional for kids without test scores. And with that kind of academic profile, you're a strong candidate. And that 1050 will only muddy the waters. So I want to stand purely on the merits of my GPA and my rigor and everything else, because my test score is not going to help me. And you only submit if it's going to help you. Never submit that'll hurt you. Like you never send a 1 in an AP class. Bury that. They might think maybe you got a 3, never confirm that you tanked it. That doesn't help you at all. So that's a critical thing. Rick Clark is a buddy, he's a friend. We do podcasts together on occasion. We do webinars together. Rick's like, hey, if you're in the middle 50th percentile, upper, send your score. But if you're in the bottom quartile, I probably would not send that score. Here's an example of what that means. The quartiles, so here, Colorado Buffs, they're middle 50. Half the class who enrolls, it's from the common data set, have between an 1170 and an 1380. That means a quarter of kids are 1390 plus, and a quarter of kids are 1160 and below. What Rick is saying here is if you're a standard school on this webinar, you score an 1120, don't send it. It's not going to help you. It's going to only hurt you. The few exceptions are if you're from a school where the average test score is like a 1050 and you scored an 1140, very low income, a lot of first-gen kids, or you're from a place where almost no one goes to college, that's different. But the majority of kids going to feeder schools or pretty decent public schools or private schools, that's not the profile. And so I would say withhold that score. Anything over that 1270, you always send. Always, 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 always send middle 50 and above. It's a little bit of wishy-washy if you're in that third quartile. Because let's say, for example, I have an 1170, but again, I have killer grades, amazing rigor, everything is crushing it, and I have 11. I'm right on the cusp of the bottom quartile. I would probably not send that score. And conversely, but let's say I have a 3.5 unweighted, and I have 6 advanced classes, but I have a 1250. I'd probably send that. And there's another thing here. If I'm going to be a STEM kid, and I have a really strong sub-score. So I only have, let's say, a 1200, but I'm applying to be an engineer and I have a 720, well, that's a pretty wide spread. Let's say I have a 700 on math and 500 on verbal, but I want to be an engineer. I want to make sure the committee sees my 700. So I would send it, even though it's a little bit low, that they understand I'm a good math kid. I'm top 2% on math. That helps me. All right. So I believe I have 10 questions and 11 questions. All right, here we go. Now we're going to shift over. If you need any information, info at Applerouth. Yeah, the fact that you're on the webinar means you probably already know how to find us. But we obviously help a lot of kids with testing. We have for 24 years. We've helped tens of thousands of kids get into college and get scholarship money and all the good stuff. All right, here we go. So let me dive into your questions. Yes, the optional science, take it. Do you recommend using the concurrent concordance for students to see which test they must be better at? Yes, without question. And again, they're going to reconcord next year. It's not going to move that much. It might move 10, 20 points. So this one, at the most, it'll move 30 points, which is like 1 point for the ACT. But I would say we can't predict which way it's going to move, and it might not move at all. So it might move on the tails, but not toward the center. You can't tell. So I would say yes. And also the colleges are using the current concordance. So use what they're using. None of them are pushing back and saying we don't believe the concordance. Everyone's going with it. What's the impact on the SAT score depending upon what secondary pathways you take? You are limited. You are capped. If you go the pathway of the easier module, so I missed 6 on the front end, even if I crush every single question on the adaptive module, I'm not going to get more than a 660. That's my cap. So the idea of being strategic, let me tank the first one and crush the second one. No, because you're stuck. Because part of it is you already missed 6 questions. And you can't, even on the old test, if you miss 6 questions, you're not getting a 700 ever. And so you are limited. And it's but similar fashion. If you get, let's say you crush the first section, you get through, and you miss every single question on the back end. Well, by the fact of you getting more than 2/3 right, your minimum score is a 440, even if I miss every single question after that. So the range between a 440 and a 660, you could have gone to the hard module and tanked it, or gone to the easy module and crushed it. But I can't tell. If I get a 680, I clearly went to the hard module. If I get a 420, I clearly went to the easy module. But if I get a 500, I could have gone either path. So, and again, and they don't ever tell you if you ended up going to the easy or hard module. That's never revealed on the score return. So that's interesting. So that's pretty wild. But kids can tell if suddenly, because the way the math works, like they're just, you're starting off, the math is harder. And some kids can differentiate, oh, wow, this really is a more difficult test. If a student takes both the ST and the ACT, can a student take the best math score from the ST and the best reading from the ACT and submit? That's called super duper scoring. And the school like Georgia Tech does that. That's a test flexible policy. And like I think NYU, there are a few schools, and that's going to be on their websites if they're test flexible like that. But that's a pretty rare position to be super duper scoring. But there are a handful of schools in the country who do super duper score like that. For kids that are stronger in math and read comprehension, which test makes more sense? Well, it depends again by the presentation of the math and the kind of math, because the math on SAT, that's algebra, that's function notation, that's exponents. That's 7 and 10 of the questions. So some kids are better at that. However, like some kid, but again, it's you have a little bit more time per question. But the ACT, you have more focus on geometry. Some kids are better at that. There's more trig questions than, first like the 1 trig question or maybe 2 on the SAT. You also, a little bit faster. But I would say give a kid a dual baseline. Give your kid a practice SAT, ACT, and you'll find out. But the math is more advanced on the ACT, but also, it's a little bit faster. But some kids like that, the format. All right, which test the colleges give more preference? They don't. The SAT, the ACT, every school in the country will take either one, with the exception of a couple crazy, tiny, small regional, like there's like a Long Island poly thing. But the national universities, the 4-year thing, they're indifferent. They are totally indifferent because, again, in certain markets, like in Chicago, the majority of kids take the ACT, and schools all over the nation want those Chicago kids. So they're not going to be prejudiced and say, you must take the SAT, because they have contracts with their schools. They're all taking the same test. And so there are differences in market across the country, and colleges are indifferent. Have you seen any data that shows which test students with ADHD do better on? Well, by the merits of the ACT is speedier and the SAT gives you more time, that could be a factor. But also the ST has higher level of reading. But one thing, if you get extra time on the ACT, that's a banger for kids who have extra time in the combination because they have processing speed deficits or ADHD or those kind of issues. But I would say, again, take it. And if you have an accommodation, take it with the combination and see which one you do better on. But I couldn't ever guess because some kids, they're better, they're ADHD, but they're really good readers. They can handle the SAT, higher level of reading. So it really depends. Would you consider a high ST score to be more beneficial than multiple AP classes for the college resume? That's going to depend upon the admissions office. They're going to have their own policies, their own preferences, their own algorithm. And some of them, STs loom larger, big state schools, other places. Other ones, like they're going to look closely at those APs. And here's the thing. There's multiple APs taken, and that's going to be your grades. I take the AP and I get an A in the class. But then there's AP scores. Did I get a 4 on bio? Did I get, a 5 on computer science principles? Or did I get an A in the class and not send my score, which means I probably got under a 3 or 3 or below. So I would say it depends on the school and also depends on am I sending out there my strong AP scores. And for a school like Emory said, we're going to be looking more closely at those AP scores because we don't believe the grades as much. And so again, it'll depend on the philosophy of the admissions office. What about when the mid 50 is so stupidly high? An amazing score may still be in the lower 20 percentile. What then? One thing that I do, which is a little bit inside baseball, is I look at something called the Common Data Set, CDS, Common Data Set for the school. And I look back to 2020, and they have them on file going back for many, many years. And because for schools, this is schools that are test optional, obviously. Because the test required, you get sent it anyways. But schools that are optional, what happens when you're test optional is the bottom quarter to a bottom third, to the bottom half, depending on the school, of kids stop sending scores. Like New Hampshire, only a fifth of kids send scores. So a bunch of kids with lower scores aren't sending them, which means that a score that would have been great 5 years ago is now in the lower quartile. I would go and look at where their averages were 5 years ago. Because honestly, the kind of kids applying really haven't changed. They're just withholding those lower scores and suppressing them. So that would help me. If I get a score like a 33 and Penn says, no, you're below our mid 50 is a 34 to a 35. I would still send my 33 because I want them to know I got a 33, not a 25. And so in that case, again, looking back at, but now Penn's required, so you must send it anyways, but they were optional until this year. So that's where, again, look at the common data set, go back a few years pre-pandemic. And if the score you have now was competitive then, and you're proud of that score, I would send the score. I think you just answered. Oh, good. Very good. For students with 1.5 time accommodations, is there a recommendation? SAT, ACT? Yes. I mean, in my experience, if you get the accommodation for the ACT, because it's a speedier test, it's more valuable because more kids finish the SAT with or without extra time. But the ACT, and my God, double time, woo, or multi-day, that is just amazing. They still offer that. But yeah, more time is really more valuable for the ACT. But I would still practice if you get a combination for both, try it. Do a practice test. If the SAT or ACT is taken multiple times, is that a drawback or encouraged? Earlier days, they took the average you heard. No, they don't care. You can take it 1 time, 2 times, even 10 times. But after 3 times, you're mostly wasting your money and time. I rarely, if ever, see students do better after the 4th. And I recommend taking it 3 times. Unless you get your 1 and done, your score is perfect, you're flawless. I got a 33, I'm in. Great for the honors program or whatever you need. But typically, if you're doing practice tests and deliberate practice, by the 3rd test, you're essentially done. And taking it like 8 times, but they don't average. Almost no one averages. And and most of them will take your best and they'll super score. Some of them, like Georgetown, want to see everything, but you have this thing called score choice, where you send what you want to send and you withhold what you want to withhold. And the majority of schools are there, like they'll honor self-reporting, where I write in my comment app, I got a 1250, and then if you're admitted, then you send the confirming official score reports. But they'll take your word Because if you're lying, then you can't go to the school. So that's a deal breaker. And so you can't lie. But then once you're accepted, then you send the confirmatory score reports and spend the money. Can I be on an easier module in reading and harder math? Yes, they are distinct. So you open up, you walk in there, and you have your verbal module, 10-minute break, and then your adaptive verbal. I'm sorry. You take the verbal, your baseline verbal module, then you get the adaptive, then a 10-minute break. You go in there, then the math, your baseline math, all the same, then the harder math, then you're done. So you can totally be on the hard verbal and easier math. And they don't tell you, though, if you get good at this, you can actually start to tease it out. For a ninth grader, what are timelines? Once you start prepping and you take it, don't take it when you're a ninth grader. There is no reason. Because again, the SAT is on an 11th grade reading level. And the math for the SAT, it goes through Algebra 2. For the AC, it's a little bit of pre-cal. And so ninth grader, you haven't seen all the content. And I never want to teach you the content in a prep class. I want to review. So I would say wait. We work with some really advanced 10th graders at the end of 10th grade. If they're in pre-cal or they're already crushing their advanced reading, language arts, they're just killing it. And then some of those kids do very well in the sophomore year. But the majority, I'd say 9 to 10 of our kids, we say wait till you finish sophomore year, and then you're golden. If you're in Algebra 2, wait 1 semester, and then start taking it in the spring, junior year. That's how I recommend this. Advice on test prep for perfecting the language section from a 740. Yeah, 740 baseline verbal. That's great. You only are missing 2 or 3 questions, maybe 4. And so you need to be drilling the hardest material. And again, the section goes from easy to hard 4 times with mechanics and with the rhetorical synthesis questions. You want to drill the hardest ones you can find, take the hard tests, make sure you always end up the hard baselines. And you just, this one now is prep books. You have to prep the hard materials and see what you're missing, why you're missing it. What are you falling for? Why are you falling for C? What word traps, are you similar? There's a synonym you missed. Oh gosh, I missed this word. That was the linchpin word. You got to really drill. Also, I recommend if you have $50, whatever it is, buy our book. We go through a lot of good strategies and we have tons of practice. So use free materials if you want, use paid materials if you want, get a tutor who's going to just only drill you on the hardest stuff. And only for a few hours. You're a 740, I want a 780, 800. I mean, those last few points are tough, but you can definitely improve from a 740. We do that all the time. That's our bread and butter. And you talk about bringing writing section back because of ChatGPT. Nothing yet. Because so many kids are doing their essays with ChatGPT. There are many schools who are saying we're not really evaluating kids on their writing ability with like Duke, that we know kids are using language models, but they're still evaluating you on what story you choose to tell. What element of your character or personality do you want to write about? Everyone knows that you're getting some help either through a parent or through a language model to punch it up a little bit. So they aren't judging you on your writing skills. Same thing like their teachers who teach Spanish in college, like suddenly all my kids are making no more grammar errors. Surprise, surprise, because they're running everything through a screen on ChatGPT, Gemini, or Claude. But there's no word yet about schools requiring the essay. The essay is still there on the ACT. That's only used pretty much for English as foreign language kids, international kids. And some states are using it to evaluate the writing skills of different high schools in their state. But we don't recommend anyone doing the essay domestically unless they start to require it, which will be a surprise, but it could happen. Does the amount of attempts taken on factor in college point of view? No, they don't care. The question is, do they have the score that we need to report for our freshman class profile? Our average is a 1420. If you took it 7 times to get there, so be it. 1 time, so be it. They're not going to let a kid in because they took it 1 time for 7. They don't care about that. Once you've checked the box for testing, they're on to everything else. And for schools that are very selective, everything else matters a lot in terms of your activities and leadership and demonstrated interest, all the other pieces of the application. So don't worry so much about how many times, but use practice tests. You shouldn't take it more than 3 times is a sweet spot. 4 is a hard stop in my book. But they're not going to let you in or turn you away because you took it 4 times. And again, with score choice, you choose. Only Georgetown and a few schools require everything submitted. Otherwise, they give you the choice. High school student at the PSAT last year, I have found that there are many changes to the test from what I've studied and what your books are published a year or 2 ago. Are there new training programs that you would say adapt for the changes and add it? Well, I would say the Applerouth. We obviously work our tails off on this and spent thousands of hours adapting our curriculum in our books. And there'll be an updated book, like the official stuff, the College Board, use that. But an old Gruber and old McGraw-Hill, yeah, it's outdated. I mean, if you have an old format book with a long form test, that's trash. Not helpful. The timing is all wrong. Even the question types are wrong. And so don't, for some of the questions, it's similar, but a lot of the questions, you're wasting your time and energy. So I would say only, and now this changed over. It was the PSAT in 2024. So we've had, we're going on, a year and a half. Companies have had time. So I would say only use updated materials, College Board materials, Applerouth, Princeton Review, Kaplan. We've all done the homework. But yeah, I would chuck the old books at this point. Uh, all right. So that is the end. And I answered all the questions. So I want to thank you guys for being here. I hope it was helpful. It's one of my interests, all these interesting tests. If you have any more questions, we're going to have more of these. And again, we're sending you a link so you can share it with loved ones, spouses, kids, show them, reach out to us, info@Applerouth. And I want to thank you all so much for being here and being here tonight. So everyone have a great night.